Hi everyone, Tasha Jordan here. Great to be with you today. Today we want to talk about surveys, and this is a great chapter on how to write surveys, making sure that the survey is actually asking the information that we need to make actionable decisions, making sure we're following best practices as we create our surveys. You may or may not be writing a survey for your project, but many of us use surveys on a regular basis in the workplace, and we also work with marketing research companies who create surveys on our behalf. So we definitely need to know about how to write a good survey, best practices, and everything else that is in this chapter. This is an important part of the chapter. We definitely want to make sure we are following the steps for conducting a survey. I love this chapter because many of you have probably created surveys and just kind of followed your best instinct as a communication professional. And what you'll probably see here in this chapter is you were actually following best practices. And this will give you a really great background of the theory behind why what you're doing is effective. This is a great table for you to think about the different types of surveys that you might want to implement in your research project. Of course, everything we do applies to the project at the end of the semester, right? So as you definitely go through this chapter, think about the ways in which we can take what we're learning here and apply it to our own project. So maybe you want to administer an online survey, which I think would be a really effective way of getting some data for your project. And so this goes over advantages and disadvantages. Let's talk a little bit about writing the questions, because even if we use OpenAI to help us write the questions, we need to make sure that the types of questions we're including will actually get the data that we need. And then we need to use precise word choice. So one thing we've talked about in this course already is the idea that words have to mean the same thing to the people responding to the survey. So the very specific survey questions are the best. And there really is an art and a science to writing good survey questions. We've talked already about scales. So we're going to bring that word back and let's look at the types of scales. When we think about what we're doing for this project, there's no reason to reinvent the wheel, right? So we can find existing questions and information, reliability and validity, and we can find that online. There's a source here. And then we definitely want to think about just the steps to make our survey easier for people to answer and user-friendly. So if you think about the reasons why you're likely to fill out a survey, there's a couple things we want to keep in mind. You can't ask questions about things that have happened a long time ago and expect to get really super specific answers. You also need to make all your choices exhaustive. And this is a common error with people who are not used to writing surveys. And a good example of this is when surveys ask you an age or how long you've been working here. And then they give you a range of options, and then your answer is actually outside of the range of options, right? So that's what we mean when we say make your choices exhaustive. We need to make our choices mutually exclusive so that more than one answer would not make sense, right? And then, of course, we need to make sure that the scale makes sense given the phrasing of a question. So an example would be when you watch a series on Netflix, how often do you binge watch the entire series? And then you can see the scale doesn't make any sense for this question. Another really common mistake that I see is including more than one question per concept or having bias in your survey questions. Okay, some other things to keep in mind. You want to make sure that you're following the ethical guidelines that we have already established in terms of best practices. And then I would also make this a pretty short survey. So you can see only the most motivated respondent will spend longer than 10 minutes completing a survey. Of all the surveys that I have answered, I think that's probably the biggest issue I see is that they're too complicated and they take too long. and then you're going to have people bailing out as you go halfway through the survey. So follow the steps here, and we're going to talk a lot about analyzing data in another chapter. There's some great information here if you decide to use a survey in your research project. And then, of course, everyone needs to know this as a communication professional with a master's in communication.